Okay, welcome to the third lecture for Unit 1. This is the lecture that is going to cover a section called America Abroad, 1877 to 1908. So we're going to look at American foreign policy for about the first 30 years after the Civil War ended, or actually after Reconstruction ended. And that will take us right up to the verge of World War I. All right. Now, over here. Okay. There we go. For most of its history, most of its early history, the United States stayed out of the affairs of other countries. George Washington had told his countrymen to avoid entangling alliances with foreign nations, that it was okay to trade with other nations, but to not get involved with their problems. And the United States pretty much kept to that advice for about the first century of its existence. In fact, before the Civil War, there were only two reasons why the United States would intervene in foreign nations. One was to protect American lives, and two was to protect American commercial property. And so this would include, for example, the fight with the North Africa pirates, what are called the Barbary Coast Wars. That had happened during the Jefferson administration back in the 1800s. And there have been some brief periods in China in the 1850s and in Korea where the U.S. had to send in troops to either protect American lives or protect commercial property. After the Civil War, the United States is going to start spreading out overseas and building an empire. We as Americans don't like to think of our nation as an imperial power because of our great tradition of self-government, the idea that people should be allowed to choose for themselves what sort of government that they wish to have. We tend to not think of ourselves as an imperial power the way Great Britain or France were, or we will to imperialism. We say it's more of a benevolent imperialism. Benevolence is often in the eye of who's being benevolent and who's receiving benevolence. Let me define imperialism before we go any further. Imperialism, and this comes from the dictionary, the policy of forming and maintaining an empire in order to control raw materials and gain access to world markets by conquest and setting up colonies. All right, the policy of forming and maintaining an empire in order to control raw materials and gain access to world markets by conquest and setting up colonies. Okay. Obviously, we in the United States are very familiar as part of our founding story with being part of Great Britain's empire. Great Britain had an empire in North America in order to gain access to raw materials and to a market by setting up colonies, which is what the original 13 colonies were. All right. So we're familiar with the concept. And again, after Reconstruction, after 1877, the United States is going to start setting up its own empire, largely in the Pacific and in the Western Hemisphere, what we're going to call, sort of shortcut, Latin America, or everything south of the Rio Grande, to make it even more of a shortcut. There were several elements that pushed the United States to becoming an imperial power. First of all, there were economics, again, which we saw in the definition, raw materials and world markets. The United States, as it became a large manufacturing power, needed raw materials and needed new markets for finished products. What we're calling strategic concerns, I can spell concerns, there we go. We need, for our Navy, for the U.S. Navy, we need access to harbors, okay, for refueling, places where the Navy can dock and take on supplies and fuel. And so that's going to lead also to setting up naval bases as part of our growing imperialism. Religious impulse. Bringing Christianity and white civilization to people regarded as backwards. And we'll see some examples of that here in a few moments. Not only bringing Christianity to religion, but also bringing white civilization, white values, white virtues to other people in the world. And then finally, what was called social Darwinism, which is a gross misapplication of Darwin's ideas, but basically taking what Darwin talked about in survival of the fittest and applying it to nations. And so the idea here being that the strong nations should rule the weak nations. Okay, again, a gross misapplication of Darwin's ideas. And we'll see social Darwinism really reaching its peak on our way to World War II. But we'll see the effect it has in the build-up towards World War I as well. So all of these reasons, economic, strategic, religious impulse, and social Darwinism, are going to drive the United States towards an empire in the Pacific and in the Western Hemisphere. These same concerns had also driven us to conquer North America. The economic concerns, the strategic concerns with the building of military bases, religious impulse, bringing white civilization to not only Native Americans, but also to Hispanics living in the West. And then, although they wouldn't have called it social Darwinism in the 1840s, certainly the idea that a strong nation should rule the weak nation was there. So these impulses have been part of the American DNA for a long time. We're just taking them now and projecting them outside of the United States, projecting them into the Pacific and into Latin America. Well, one place where we can see all of these things come together, economic, strategic, religious, social Darwinism, is in the United States' relationship with Hawaii, which will eventually, Hawaii will become, of course, part of the American empire, and then later, of course, become a state, unlike other parts of the American empire, which are still not states, such as Puerto Rico and Guam. Well, what do we have with Hawaii? Well, the first Americans to go to Hawaii went back in the 1700s, and those were missionaries who took Christianity to Hawaii. Okay, so the religious impulse. Their children and grandchildren became the sugar barons of Hawaii. Hawaii is very good for sugar, much in the same way Cuba is very good for sugar. And so these missionaries, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren became the sugar barons who took control of Hawaii. Now, in 1875, and we're going to get a little wonky here, Hawaii entered into an agreement where it could sell sugar to the United States without paying taxes on it, okay, which was very good for the sugar barons. They didn't have to pay any tax on the sugar they sold to the U.S. In 1887, the United States established a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so we talked about strategic concerns. By 1890, 2% of Hawaii's population controls 75% of Hawaii's health. Of Hawaii's wealth. And of course, that wealth is built on sugar. And that 2% of the population is the white Hawaiian population. Now, that year, 1890, Hawaii lost its tax-free sugar status. Remember that Hawaii had been allowed to sell its sugar to the United States without paying import taxes. It lost that deal in the 1890s. And what that led to was an economic downturn in Hawaii. Now, obviously, the economic problems would be solved if Hawaii became somehow part of the United States, which is kind of what the white people in Hawaii wanted. In 1891, Hawaii's last monarch, Queen Lily, took the throne. These are no, this is American Samoa. Here we go. Here's Hawaii. So again, long way from the United States. In fact, but definitely part of shipping routes. As you can see here from this picture, Hawaii is sort of at the center of shipping routes in the Pacific. We don't need this or this. Might need that. But Queen Lily, we see here, Queen Lily becomes the last monarch of Hawaii in 1891. She went against the plantation, the sugar barons. She recognized that it was time to claw back some of the wealth and some of the power that the sugar barons had over Hawaii. And this set her at odds, of course, with the sugar barons. In 1893, a quote unquote rebellion, and I'm putting the word rebellion in quote marks, against Lily began. It appears that the whole rebellion was ginned up or created by the sugar barons. And the reason they did this was to create the illusion of danger to Americans in Hawaii, which triggered the U.S. Marines being sent into Hawaii, and eventually the end of Hawaii's monarchy, as Queen Lily is forced to surrender as monarch to the sugar barons. Now, at that point, the sugar barons began asking the United States to make Hawaii part of the United States. And that's kind of where things come to a stop at. The president at this time was Grover Cleveland. And Cleveland was deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the circumstances under which Queen Lily had been deposed. The fact that a rebellion that appeared to only exist in people's imaginations began, that Marines had been sent into Honolulu, that Hawaii's monarch had been forced out. Cleveland wasn't comfortable with this, and so he declined to have anything to do with Hawaii becoming part of the United States. Again, deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Hawaii eventually became the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, and then in 1898, with a different president, Hawaii is annexed to the United States. It becomes a U.S. territory. It doesn't become a state. There were concerns about, if Hawaii becomes a state, the fact is, most of the people who live in Hawaii are not white. And so there is a concern about adding a state that's mainly Polynesian and Asian, where whites are definitely in the minority. So even though Hawaii becomes part of the American empire, it will not become a state for another half century. So we've seen it all in Hawaii. We saw the religious impulse, we saw strategic concerns, social Darwinism's kind of mixed in there. Again, the idea that the sugar barons, who were basically all but ruling Hawaii, and then were ruling Hawaii once they got rid of Queen Lily, and then the economic concerns with regards to sugar. And so all of the elements coming together in a relatively short period of time. Once things really got going in 1875, it only took 18 years to destroy the Hawaiian monarchy. Now, after Grover Cleveland's presidency, the new president was a guy named William McKinley. And we talked about McKinley in the last lecture because he gets shot in 1901. But one of McKinley's big selling points, or one thing that McKinley is famous for, is getting the United States into a war with Spain in 1898. And so let me give you some background here before we get to it. Now, Spain still had a few bits and pieces of its empire left. It had Guam, it had Puerto Rico, it had Cuba, it had the Philippines. That was about all that was left of the Spanish Empire. Well, in 1895, a rebellion broke out in Cuba against Spain, against Spanish rule. There's a lot of Americans who live in Cuba. There's a lot of American commercial property in Cuba. And so this already is sort of making the president nervous. Most Americans sided with Cuba. Americans, because our country is born out of a revolution, we have a tendency to support revolutions as long as they're not against us. We're all for them. And we'll get to that story here momentarily. But the rebellion breaks out against the Spanish. Most of American opinion, again, sides with the revolutionaries. In 1896, the Spanish sent one of their best generals, General Weyler, who we see here in this picture, this mutton chop mustache combination that I can't seem to get to grow out. General Weyler was sent there to put down the rebellion. And he decided to do this with a policy that he called the reconcentrado, which basically entailed putting Cuban villagers into, and it's in the name, concentrado, concentration camps. Now, these are not meant to be the sort of death camps that we associate concentration camps with because of the Nazis. These were just villages, camps. About 300,000 Cuban villagers were forced into these camps, and those camps were no way equipped for 300,000 people. And so disease becomes a problem, hunger becomes a problem, people start to die. Okay. This is all being reported in the American press, specifically in a type of American press called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism was a very sensationalistic form of journalism. It's almost like tabloid journalism. Lots of hype, lots of murder, lots of death, lots of chaos. And it's all done to sell newspapers. So this is from the New York World. Blood on the roads, blood in the fields, blood on the doors, blood, blood, blood. The old, the young, the weak, the crippled, all butchered without mercy. And this was done again to sell papers. Now, some of the journalists actually went to Cuba. Some of them didn't. Many of the journalists simply hung out in the Florida Keys and just made shit up. So a lot of stories about rape, a lot of stories about murder, a lot of stories about torture. Here's a picture of Spaniards. It's a drawing in black and white. Spaniards search women on American steamers, and in this drawing there is a naked woman, and all these men are standing around. They're supposed to be searching her for spy shit, I guess. I don't really know. But that type of stuff starts to fill the newspapers of particularly the New York Herald and the New York World, which were owned by two different newspaper tycoons who were competing with each other, Pulitzer and Hearst. Can you lay down? Can you please go lay down and stop making so much noise? Okay, we'll be done in here in a little bit. Alrighty. Again, Americans, this made them even more anti-Spanish, all these stories that are coming out. The Spanish weren't terribly worried about American intervention as long as there was a depression on. This isn't really something we need to get into, but in 1893, the U.S. economy had crashed. And so Americans were sympathetic towards the Cubans, but not really wanting to spend a lot of money. But when William McKinley became president in 1897, the economy started to recover. Not because of anything McKinley did, it's cyclical. Economies go down, economies go up. And McKinley was also known as someone who wanted to definitely flex America's power. And so this made the Spanish very, very nervous that they were now going to have to be dealing with an expansionist like William McKinley in an economy that is recovering. In 1897, Spain gave Cuba limited self-government, but that did not stop the fighting. The fighting continued sporadically, and the fighting that was going on was getting closer and closer to Americans in Spain, and getting closer, Americans in Cuba, and getting closer and closer to American property in Cuba. In 1898, in order to protect American property, President McKinley dispatched an American ship called the Maine, an American naval ship, to Havana to sort of wave the flag and rattle the sword and let everybody know, don't be involving Americans or American property in this. On February 15th, the Maine exploded while it was in Havana Harbor. The general thinking now is that the explosion in the Maine was caused by the boiler exploding, which then blew up the munitions that were stored And here's a picture of the Maine and its destruction. But the general feeling in the United States, as you can see here from this picture, is that Spain was responsible for the murder of not only the Cuban people, but also American sailors, represented by this dead American sailor in this painting. McKinley asked Spain to just leave Cuba. Just pack up and go. All right, you've caused enough problems. Spain refused to do that. And so on April 25th, the United States declared war on Spain, starting Spanish-American War. Now, this war is going to have primarily two battlefields, Cuba and the Philippines. Guam and Puerto Rico, there's not going to be much to those, but there will be some battles in Cuba and in Puerto Rico that we need to look at. We'll start with Cuba. It's pretty quick. In June, American forces arrived in Cuba, still in 1898. They seize a beachhead down here, which eventually becomes, I believe, Guantanamo Bay. Let me check to make sure. Yes. It's about the same spot where Guantanamo Bay is today. Probably closer to this area here. There's a couple of battles. About 17,000 Americans go to Cuba. Really, this battle down here, this is pretty much the bulk of the battles. Las Guasimas, and I'm butchering these pronunciations, El Caney, Kettle Hill, San Juan Hill, Santiago, and the Spanish fleet is destroyed, and that's pretty much the war in Spain. Starts on June 24th, is over by July 3rd, with Spain splitting to leave and getting their fleet destroyed while it attempted to make a run for it. And on July 17th, Spain surrendered control of Cuba. Now, here's the thing. 17,000 Americans went to Cuba. The whole thing lasted, we could say, if we wanted to be generous, 7 days. And yet, 5,000 Americans would eventually die in Spain. Only 379 died from battle. The others died from disease. Malaria, yellow fever, bad food, canned beef was being sent down there. And remember, we talked last time about the Pure Food and Drug Act? Well, that's still 8 years away. So you open up that can of beef, and why is there rope in here? Why are there maggots in here? Yum, yum. So yeah, food illnesses, waterborne illnesses, malaria, yellow fever, awful, awful stuff. And in fact, when Teddy Roosevelt is president, one of his priorities is going to be to get the Army's supply system under some kind of control and get it modernized and up to date. It really hadn't been modernized since the Civil War ended. Now, the United States did not take direct control over Cuba. Instead, in the Cuban Constitution, which was passed in 1901, there is something in there called the Platt Amendment. And this is written directly into Cuba's Constitution. Okay. Well, what does that Platt Amendment say? Well, it says, 1, the U.S. will control Cuba's foreign policy. 2, the U.S. will keep a base at Guantanamo Bay, and I have misspelled Guantanamo. Okay, but it's still misspelled. All right, 3. The U.S. right of intervention in Cuba. So again, the United States isn't going to take direct control of Cuba. It's just going to control Cuba's foreign policy, keep a naval base in Cuba, and also reserve the right to intervene in Cuba whenever it feels is necessary. But it's not taking direct control, okay? Wink, wink. All right, and in fact, as far as interventions go, there'll be 4 of them over the next 30 years. From 1901 to 1930, the U.S. will find itself intervening 4 times in Cuba's affairs. In the 1930s, the Platt Amendment will pretty much be ditched. That's a story we'll get to. We obviously have kept Guantanamo Bay. What about the Philippines? Well, the Philippines is a different story. Let's jump slides here. Pretty quickly, the Philippines looks like the situation in Cuba. The U.S. Navy steams in there, smashes the Spanish fleet, May the 1st. Done here by this guy. And then begins a Admiral Dewey is who this guy is. And then begins a quick campaign, which then turns into something worse. Now, the U.S. is able to defeat Spain fairly quickly in the Philippines because the Filipino people had already been rebelling for a number of years. This gentleman sitting here in the center, whose name you don't need to know for the test, but I'll go ahead and give it to you, Emiliano Aguinaldo. The George Washington of the Philippines. He had been leading a rebellion against Spain for a number of years. And so the sort of groundwork had been laid by Emiliano and his rebels. And the U.S. was sort of able to plug into that and defeat the Spanish in a fairly quick amount of time. Especially when you consider how spread out the Philippines are. Emiliano naively thought that once Spain had been defeated, the United States would simply pack up and leave. And he was in for a rude surprise because the United States did not pack up and leave. And so what happens is Emiliano goes back out into the jungle and simply picks up where he left off at, only this time fighting his former allies, the Americans. And so this sets off an insurgency in the Philippines. Another word I'm having trouble spelling. There we go. The Philippines insurgency, which will run from roughly 1899 to about 1902. The United States will be battling against its former ally, Emiliano Aguinaldo. This degenerated into a dirty war very, very quickly. What we would now call war crimes were committed by both sides. This includes torture, execution, burning villages, killing civilians, that type of stuff. And it went on again for 3 years until Emiliano was captured. In the midst of all this, there was a group that argued against the Spanish-American War and against the building of the American Empire, a group called the Anti-Imperialist League, whose most famous member was Mark Twain. And they argued against the building of an empire for several reasons. One, the cost of maintaining an empire was going to be high. Two, America, again, has always been a big believer in self-rule, that nations should be allowed to choose their own destiny, not have it chosen for them. And certainly the Filipino people would like to choose their own destiny, as would people in Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And so setting up this empire was felt to be a slap in the face of America's support for self-rule. Three, it's a violation of George Washington's warning about no entangling alliances. All right, and so the Anti-Imperialist League, coming out a minority, a vocal minority, but still a minority, who came out against the idea of building an empire in overseas. See this picture here of American troops in the Philippines, what Mark Twain called firing the shells of democracy into Filipino villages. Twain, again, was extraordinarily acidically critical of America's attempt at building an overseas empire. How did the United States win in the Philippines? Well, a couple of things here helped out. One, Emiliano Aguinaldo never had the majority support of his own people. At best, Emiliano Aguinaldo had about 80,000 followers out of a population of 7 million Filipinos. Okay. And that's not to say that you have to have the majority, but you need more than that. The type of warfare being practiced in the Philippines was an insurgency, the kind of thing we dealt with in Iraq most recently. But many U.S. soldiers had fought in an insurgency in the Indian Wars. The last round of Indian Wars in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, many American soldiers had fought in those battles and were now in the Philippines. And the Army also engaged in charitable works in the Philippines. So we built schools, we built hospitals, we built Manila's sewage system. The capital of the Philippines, Manila, did not have a sewage system. Okay, the United States built that. We built roads, things like that. So this generated, some goodwill amongst the Filipino people. How long that goodwill lasted can be argued about, but it certainly helped win. If it didn't win us any supporters, it certainly kept people neutral from supporting Emiliano. Okay, and neutral is at least better than opponent. After William McKinley's death, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, becomes president, and Roosevelt was even more of an expansionist than McKinley had been. In fact, Roosevelt will be the one who really pushes the United States into Central America and the Caribbean islands. With occupations, leasings. Occupation is a polite term for an invasion. Intervention is the other word that Americans like to use, but it's an invasion. This will include, and we're not going to talk about this in class, but essentially the United States will create the nation of Panama simply to have control of the Panama Canal. Panama as a nation did not exist until the U.S. Navy went down there to support rebels trying to establish Panama. Roosevelt is also responsible for the establishment of what is called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And so let me tell you what the Monroe Doctrine is here before I get to the corollary. The Monroe Doctrine, which you should have heard about in History 1, came about in 1823, and it basically told European nations to stay out of Latin America. Now, it didn't force, because France and Portugal and Spain already had colonies in Latin America. It didn't force them to leave, but it told them, hey, if you're not here already, don't bother to show up, okay? Latin America is not open for any more colonies by Europeans. For the most part, it's not really enforced, but Roosevelt will be the one to enforce it. And he'll enforce it by coming up with the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, corollary is sort of an amendment. So if you think of the Monroe Doctrine and think of this being an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so what happened here? Venezuela in 1902 Venezuela defaulted on loans to several European nations. And some of those nations sent their navies to collect the money. Okay? The British Navy, the French Navy were sent to Venezuela to, help the Venezuelans find their wallet and pay their bills. Roosevelt didn't like that. He didn't like European countries coming over here and pushing around poor, weaker Latin American nations. And so what the Roosevelt Corollary does, or what it says, is it warns Latin American nations to keep their affairs in order or face intervention by the United States. So it warns Latin American nations to keep their affairs in order or face intervention by the United States. And it's used for the first time in 1904. In 1904, the Dominican Republic, same situation, is on the verge of default. And so basically, the U.S. took over tax collection for the Dominican Republic took over collecting the taxes and took over paying off the loans until they were paid off. And it won't be the last time. Again, and you can kind of see here this cartoon of Roosevelt facing down the European powers here at Santo Domingo. But it also becomes this, okay? Speaking softly and carrying a big stick. That the United States, in terms of Latin America, will be the one arbitrating between the old world of Europe, Russia, Britain, the French, Germans, and the Latin American nations over here. And again, if we go back to this map, you can see the many, many times where the United States is going to intervene throughout protectorates, military expeditions, canal zones. This has caused, as you can imagine, even today, over 100 years later, some hard feelings, and I think rightfully so, to having your country invaded by the Americans every couple of years. Probably gets old after a while. But I do want to point out that in some instances, the intervention by the United States saved lives. Nicaragua, that country was on the precipice of an all-out civil war that would have killed a lot of people. Instead, the Marines took charge and averted the Civil War, and helped cool things off. But yeah, you can definitely see how this type of stuff leads a really strained relationship with Latin America. Now, this Roosevelt Corollary thing will get dropped in the 1930s. As you can see here, it looks like Haiti is the last country in occupation, 1934, along with Nicaragua up till 1933. And in many of these countries, we did like the Philippines and Haiti. We built 1,000 miles of roads. We built 200 bridges. We built 11 hospitals for the Haitians. Very little of this at taxpayer expense. But the whole thing just collapsed after we left. So, one other place where the United States was swinging its weight around was out in the Pacific, and we already saw that with the occupation of the Philippines. The occupation of the Philippines, I'm going to copy this and move it down here to where it goes, brought us into potential conflict with the Japanese. Now, we haven't talked about Japan a lot here, but in 1895, in 1905, my bad, Japan stumped Russia in a war called the Russo-Japanese War, which Russia lost. Okay, Russia lost a war to Japan. And this made the United States very nervous because it clearly indicated that Japan was going to be a major power in the Pacific. And it was felt that that would be a threat to the Philippines, which is where the United States was. So, in order to sort of come to an understanding with Japan, in 1905, the United States and Japan signed what was called the Taft-Katsura Treaty. And the terms of this treaty is that Japan would leave the Philippines alone, and in response, the United States would leave Japan's occupation of Korea alone. Okay. So Japan gets to have Korea, no questions asked by the Americans. The Americans get to have the Philippines, no questions asked by the Japanese. You know who isn't consulted about this? The Koreans and the Filipino people. Why not? And so that brings us to the end of this lecture. We have seen how the United States has flexed its imperial power in the Pacific, in just a few places, Hawaii, the Philippines. We also grabbed hold of the Samoan Islands down here. It's a story we didn't talk about. It's part of those trade routes. And so we've also seen how the U.S. flexing its power in Latin America. Again, mixed results, a mixed legacy at best. Lecture 4 will be about World War I. And there's going to be, for a class that is supposed to be about U.S. history, we're going to have to spend considerable amounts of time in Europe, particularly for World War I and World War II. We'll slide off a bit after World War II. So that'll be the next video, will be World War I. All right. And as always, if you have questions or comments, you can always reach me either by email, office hours, anything like that. All right, so I will see you in the next video.